In order to understand approach notes, you have to realize that it's related to the meter. Meter matters. Okay. Now, here's how it works. In 4/4 time, we consider quarter notes to be what we call the metrical level. That means the notes, the melody, a melody like this is moving along at the rate of the metrical level. It's moving along. Every new note is one beat, and that's what is described by the meter 4/4. There's 4 beats in a measure. In that scheme, there's a group of 4, right? And the first is strong, the second is weak, the third is strong, and the fourth is weak. That's the way we hear groups of 4. When a melody is moving like this, anything on beat 1 or 3 is a target note, and anything in between is an approach tone, because it's moving at the metrical level, and it's all about the groups of 4. That's the thing you got to remember. Groups of 4 are going to be interpreted or heard as strong, weak, strong, weak. And approach tones can only happen on the weak points of the pattern. Okay? So this is a target, this is an approach. This is a target, this is an approach. And it will go on like that until the melody rhythms change. So at this quarter note rhythm, a target can be on 1 and 3, and approach notes can be on 2 and 4. Now, if the melody gets slowed down, then everything gets stretched out. So now the group of 4 occupies 2 measures, and the strong weak pattern is stretched out. So now you could have a target note on 1 and a target note on 1 over here, and then this note would become an approach note, because again, it's on the weak stress of the grouping of 4, strong, weak, strong, weak. Now if we go the other direction, and this is called, by the way, this is called the supermetrical level. This is the level that is longer note values than the level of the meter. Okay, now we go, and you can see here it is labeled target, approach, target, approach. Okay, now we go to the other direction where the melody is moving at a faster rate than the meter, and this is called the submetrical level. And at this level, all the downbeats are targets. Every single downbeat is a target, and the upbeats are approach tones. Okay? So you can't, before you can just, when you're analyzing a melody or when you're writing a melody, you're only going to be able to assess whether something's a target or an approach if you understand this concept, that the rate at which the melody notes are going by are going to affect whether we hear something as a target or an approach note. Again, at the metrical level, it's all about groups of 4. Target, approach, target, approach. At the supermetrical level, target, approach, target, approach. And at the submetrical level, target, approach, target, approach, target, approach. Now, if you have a mixture, then you have to analyze it according to what's happening at that moment in the melody. So here we have quarter notes, so we're at the metrical level. So this is a target, and that's an approach. Here we have eighth notes. We're at the submetrical level. So that's a target, that's an approach, that's a target, and that's an approach. And then here we're at the supermetrical level. So everything's been stretched out. That's a target, that's an approach, and that's a target. Okay, now the next thing to know is the different categories of approach tones. The first one is a passing tone. They have very specific definitions. You have to understand the definitions. Okay, so a passing tone is a very specific thing. It is a note which joins two other notes on either side a third apart. So if this is here, that note is a third apart. The note that joins them by step is a passing tone. Now remember, to be an approach note, it must resolve into its target by step. So this is another point. You can't have an approach note that's leaping into its target. It has to be moving by step into the target to be an approach note. So target, we're at the metrical level. So target, approach, target, approach. And what kind of approach? It's a passing tone because it's joining two notes a third apart by step. Anything other than that, it's not a passing tone. It's something else. Okay, then there's a neighbor tone. A neighbor tone is a note that you go to one step above the target or below and then returns to the target. That's a neighbor tone. You can have an upper neighbor or a lower neighbor. The next thing is an unprepared approach. That's when the approach note is preceded by either a rest or a leap. Now notice the approach still does go in by step to its target. That's part of the definition of an approach note. It must resolve by step into its target. Otherwise, it's not an approach note. Here's one way to have an unprepared approach is to proceed with a rest. Here's another way to have an unprepared approach, to proceed it with a leap. So that's why this is unprepared, but it still resolves by step into its target. And indirect resolution. Indirect resolution is when you have two notes which are sort of like upper and lower neighbor tones, but they don't return to the target in between. You do the lower neighbor, the upper neighbor, then you go to the target. And you can go from either direction, below, above, into the target, or above, below, into the target. And they can be chromatic, or they can be diatonic, or a mixture. This is a double chromatic approach. I think that's self-explanatory. And remember, target tones always coincide with a strong rhythmic stress, so the harmony will relate to the target tones. Okay, now finally, let's talk about, these are the various kinds of approach. Make sure you thoroughly understand them. And then let's talk about, here's an example of how a melody, a pretty complex melody, would be analyzed with this method. Okay, so here we are at the metrical level, target, passing tone. Now submetrical level, target, passing tone, target, double chromatic approach, target, unprepared approach, it's preceded by a rest, target, approach, target, approach, target, indirect resolution, target, approach. These are passing tones because they're joining two notes a third apart. And there's a target, there's a passing tone because now we're at the supermetrical level, and so on. Now another thing about targets, they have to be available notes, which means they have to be chord tones or available tensions. They can't be, you can't have a target that's a harmonica void note. Okay, now what's an anticipation? Anticipation is when a note that would have been a target is moved forward in time, and then it's followed by a tie or a rest. If you just have this note, no tie, and then you repeat it, that's not an anticipation, that's just a repeated note. So you have to have the tie so that this is the only note heard. Then it will sound like an anticipation. Da, 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 da. If you just play it again, it's not an anticipation, it's just a repeated note. Da, 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 da. That's no anticipation there. So that's an anticipation because it's followed by a tie. Here's an anticipation, it's followed by a rest. Da, 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 da. That's also an anticipation because it's the last thing you heard. The key to an anticipation is that you do not hear anything on the subsequent downbeat. Nothing new is happening on the subsequent downbeat. Okay, that's what an anticipation is. Finally, understanding what an available note is. When you look at notes written out as a chord scale, if you're not quite sure what that means, of course, a chord scale is a group, is when you look at all the notes that could possibly be available on a chord, including the chord tones plus the surrounding notes, diatonic notes. So, for example, let's take a, I don't know, we're in the key of C. Let's take, say, an E minor 7. Okay, I'm going to imagine E minor 7, 3 minor 7 in the key of C. All right, so let me show you how this would work. Chord scales means that you would write out all the chord tones, and then because this is a diatonic chord, you would put the diatonic notes in between the chord tones, and then you would assess whether or not those non-chord tones are, quote, available. And the way you do that is you assess them by saying if the note is a half step above the chord tone below it, it is not available. And if it's a whole step above the chord tone below it, it is available. And this has to do with levels of dissonance. If a note is a half step above the chord tone below it, that means when you play it against the chord, it will be too dissonant for the chord, the typical use of that chord. So here I am, I'm writing out the chord scale here. And my chord, of course, is an E minor 7, which is 3 minor 7 in the key of C. And I'm labeling it, that's my 1, so that's obviously an available note because it's a chord tone. Anything that's a chord tone will always be an available note. It will always sound good against the chord. Okay, so all of these are chord tones. They are automatically going to sound good. They're going to fit with the sound of the chord. They are not going to conflict with the sound of the chord. So our goal is to understand how do we assess these in-between notes, these non-chord tones? And that's what I'm telling you. So you look at this, you say it's an F. Is F a half step above E or a whole step? And the answer is it's a half step, so that means it's not available. It's a harmonic avoid note. And we label it by calling it S flat 2. The S means it's available in the scale but not in the chord. And flat 2 describes the interval above the root of the chord. It's a minor second above the root of the chord. And then typically we also make them have a solid note head to help them stand out. As this is basically, you got to be careful with this note. Do not emphasize it against the chord. If you do, it will sound wrong. It will sound like a wrong note. And here's an E minor, and here's what F would sound like against it. Right? It's a too dissonant for the chord, so it's not going to be usable. It's a harmonic avoid note. This note, on the other hand, is going to be fine because it's a whole step above the chord tone below it. A is a whole step above G, so it's an available tension, and therefore it would be called T11, not T4, because we call tensions by their expanded compound name. A 4 plus an octave is an 11. This is called by its small name because it's not available. And this one is, I'll give you a second to think about it, is C a half step or a whole step above B? Hopefully you figured out it was a half step. That means it's a harmonic avoid note, and it would be labeled S flat 2 because it is, S flat 6, sorry, because it is a minor sixth above the root of the chord, but it's also a half step above this. So in this chord, in 3 minor 7, there's only one diatonically available tension, which is T11, and it sounds good. That's what it sounds like. But S flat 2 does not sound good, and S flat 6 doesn't sound good either. It's too dissonant for the chord quality. So that's the rule, and so that will help you understand what should be a target. Anything that's a harmonic avoid note cannot be a target. You could target it. I mean, you could put it on a strong beat, but if you did, it would sound bad. It would sound like a wrong note, and so it would be, you don't want to do that. You want to avoid that.